Good day and welcome back. This is CSC 255. We're in Module 2 and we'll be wrapping up the content for the Module 2. So essentially, we want to check in with the textbook. This is one of the references that we've recommended for the course. It's Mastering Windows Server 2022 with Azure Cloud Services. And essentially, in this module, we needed students to read up to the first 4 chapters, right? So a lot of the things that we've covered in class about VirtualBox and building your server are hands-on practice of some of the principles and concepts that you see in each of these chapters. So if you don't have a copy of this textbook yet, I think the electronic version is pretty affordable, but I will tell you that we'll be referencing specifics in each case as needed. So one of the things that we wanted to call out today are the differences between VirtualBox and Hyper-V, okay? So in Windows, you have the opportunity to work in Hyper-V, and I'm going to attempt to connect to a Hyper-V server. And if I'm successful, we'll get a chance to look at this environment firsthand. Can everyone see my screen?
Yep, can see it.
So on the other side of the spring break, I hope to turn up a platform just like this for your use in our class. And to this point, what you've done, you've worked in VirtualBox. And VirtualBox is open source. And if you've had the CSC 235 course, the ACS Technology Virtual Lab, there was a number of things that we did with VirtualBox just to introduce the concepts. The idea that you have 2 different kinds of virtual environments, and those are called hypervisors. So stop me if you haven't heard this, or if you have heard this. There's a type 1 hypervisor and a type 2 hypervisor, and this should ring a bell, where VirtualBox open source solution runs within the operating system, so it works like another application. That's a type 2 hypervisor. A type 1 hypervisor runs right on top of the physical hardware. So VMware would be an example of this. Now, there are some implementations of Hyper-V in Microsoft where, depending on who you talk to and which software engineer, they would say, well, yeah, there's a lot of qualities like a type 1 hypervisor. But what you're seeing here in the remote connection is a GUI environment, and Hyper-V is running as a server application. So you see it listed here. And when I open up my Hyper-V manager, which is like VirtualBox manager, right? I'll run it as an administrator. what you'll see are a series of server 2022, or actually these are 2019 installations. And there's a domain environment here so that the things we talked about in the domain environment in our last class, we said if you have an enterprise security account management model, this is called a domain, and there's a lot of things you can automate using group policy objects, GPOs, on the domain level. Well, in this environment, what you see are two machines that are domain controllers, not one, but two. And they control everything else in that domain. So all of the other servers and systems are the accounts for the systems, the accounts for the users that log into the systems. Those are all controlled by the two domain controllers in an Active Directory environment. The term directory is intentional. So there's a centralized directory. It's a database of security accounts. And this allows for a great deal of automation. If you have just a few machines, any more than 4 systems, you should be operating with a domain. And you can do it cost effectively if you purchase the license to go with a server 2022 install, and then you add licenses for each server. Or if you purchase a data center license, you can essentially spin up as many standard servers as you need. So in terms of licensing, if you know you're going to be fluctuating a great deal, and at times you're going to need more systems, and for certain projects you'll scale back. It's very easy to do if you have a single system that's a data center server that's running the Hyper-V environment. Now, Hyper-V is very much like VirtualBox. So you'll see a lot of similarities. You can go into the settings and access each of the virtual components. And the same is true here. You have settings and the virtual components, right? So you can change the number of processors when the machine is not running. So I can, one advantage of working with virtual machines is that you can upgrade or conserve components as needed. So if you find out that the domain controller is running slow, you can speed that up. If you set up install machines like a WSUS server or a WDS server to install over the network and they aren't performing, you can add network cards, you can add virtual processor cores, depending on the capacity of your system. And so it's easy to adjust as needed based on the load for a given task, right? And that's a lot of flexibility. So, you know, if you need more processor power for a series of updates that are getting pushed from the WSUS server and your host machine is limited, you can throttle back some of the machines and then ramp up your WSUS server. If you're working a series of installations with WDS, which is the Windows Deployment Service, then you can do the same there. After the rollout of new operating systems is completed, you can scale it back down again. And so this is one of the benefits of having this. When it comes to network adapters, one distinction that's important to understand is that instead of having a bridged mode and a NAT mode like you find here, in the network you have bridged and NAT, right? And this is what you're familiar with here. In Hyper-V, in the Microsoft world, you can connect, you can add a new switch that's an external switch, and that is the equivalent of a bridged adapter. You can add an internal switch, and that's the equivalent of a NAT adapter. And once that's set up, you can bind it to the physical network interface. So it works very much like that. You can set up automatic start functions so that when the physical hardware is powered on within 240 seconds, within 4 minutes, this machine loads automatically. If you have to power down the physical machine, it will shut down the guest machine before the physical machine shuts down. So there's a lot of extra features there. Now, we talked about VDI disks, and one thing I wanted to call out while we had this screen up is the notion of the VHD disk. If you are creating a new machine, you can go here to a hard disk option, and you get a wizard much like the one that you see in VirtualBox. Do either of you have any questions at this point?
Nope.
Okay. So the default format that's used by VirtualBox is VDI, but they also allow you to use VHD. VHD is the native format for Microsoft Hyper-V. So if you're running virtual machines in the virtual machine server, what they call the Hyper-V server, you're going to create VHDs. You can create a set of VHDs that work in groups so that you can create clustered disks or RAID disks. VHDX allows you to create a disk that's shared. So when you use the VHDX format, you can use that same disk to create what's known as a server cluster. And I thought I would explain that a little further here. So if you create a virtual hard disk and you use the new and improved VHDX format, essentially you can create a disk that's shared by more than one server. What are we saying? We're saying that all of the other components, you can build multiple virtual machines, but they use the same disk. They use the same hard disk. And if one of those machines blows up, then it's easy for the other machines to keep using the shared hard disk. Each of those servers are operating off of that same shared hard disk. And that's one aspect of Hyper-V that's very powerful. So there are some distinctions that are different between Microsoft virtual systems and VirtualBox. And we wanted to take a little bit of time to share those with you today. The idea of a shielded virtual machine, they're talking about encrypting the entire virtual machine. You have to have a lot of muscle and a lot of really heavy-duty hardware to work that effectively if you're running as many machines as you just saw on the screen earlier. In our course reference, it shows you how to install and configure the Hyper-V role. And essentially, to do that, if you have a host machine, like the one I just showed you, whoop, hold on here. When this role was added, I basically used the same wizard that I do from the server manager. So when I installed this system and set it up the first time, I was on this screen and I added a role. You can also do this in PowerShell. This is the same thing as setting up a DNS server or a domain controller. We're going to click Next. This is what you select if you want a domain controller. This is what you select if you want a DNS machine, or if you want a network management system, you can install DHCP and DNS. But it's the Hyper-V role here. If you select this, it's gonna change your server to create virtual network interfaces that can be used for the virtual systems and with the virtual switches. So here is the other role that I wanted to show you. Windows Deployment Service. So Hyper-V is free. Once you purchase the software, you don't have to pay extra for that. SCCM, System Center Configuration Manager, it's in your, this is something you have to pay extra for. It's a special platform, but most of what you need to work efficiently and effectively when you're deploying operating systems is built in. And this one particular role, the Windows Deployment Services, that's the thing we want to take a closer look at today, okay? So as you look in our textbook and roll a little further, after you understand about Hyper-V and virtualization and understanding basics about the server operating system itself, we get to chapter 4 where we're focused on, best ways to install the Windows operating system. And here's where you see the reference to Windows Server Update Services. This is where the Microsoft updates and MSU files are stored, and you automatically push those out. You'll see this combination frequently. WSUS and WDS sort of work together. And when they work together, it's almost like magic. Between the two, you get very fast updates and you get automated installation across the network. And I don't want to walk through all of the content here, but I want to call your attention to it. Here, they call out the fact that if you don't want a graphical user interface, you install Server Core. And of course, you'll have to know more about PowerShell. We'll be picking up quite a bit of PowerShell on the other side of our spring break. Just remember that if you select during installation the standard or the data center, and it does not say desktop experience, you're getting the core version, and you have to know PowerShell to be able to get around. This is the login screen that you're going to see. Now, why am I covering this again in class? Well, some of the students are submitting for assignments and solutions, and they're saying, well, this is the screen I have, it doesn't look like yours. So that's a basic step they've missed right here, where they need to select standard with desktop experience or data center with desktop experience. And that's where the graphical user interface, the start menu in the Windows environment we've become so familiar with, are installed. There is a basic menu that appears for core installations. It's called the S-config, right? And if you don't see it and all you get is a command prompt, and we'll practice this later, you'll create a core installation, and if you want to see a handy menu to help with configuration, there is a S-config menu, and S for server, right? So server config, S-config, and it brings up this screen. And actually, if you just select each item, there are other menus that pop up for network settings or naming the computer, basic stuff. So you don't have to know a whole lot of commands in order to start working with a simple installation. There's a very few PowerShell commands that allow you to install a role in the same way that we install a role here. So instead of having the graphical environment where you can add Windows deployment service or DNS, you can simply issue a command But here's all the basics, right? Activation for Windows, update for Windows, um, configuring remote management. There is a tool that's called WAC, and another one that's Windows at Admin Center. And there are other tools called Remote Server Administration Tools, or RSAT. I want to share with you on screen what each of those are and how they work. So if I close this and then I reopen it, there's an automatic pop-up that comes up. So Server Manager is the dashboard that shows up for servers since 2019, right? So may have even been present in later iterations of 2016, but ordinarily, when you have remote server administration tools, they're just remote versions of the same tools that people are familiar with from earlier versions of Windows Server. For example, when you go into computer management, this is one of the modules that you can remotely manage systems with using RSAT. It's just a remote version of the same local thing. In fact, you see the word local. So you can right click this and connect to another computer, and now it's one of the management consoles that's used with remote server administration console tools, remote server administration tools. So whenever you see a reference to RSAT, that's the oldest of the operating system management tools that you can use to set up and configure your system. The server management console is a newer thing that came along a few years later. And now when you open up the server manager, there's a pop-up for Windows Admin Center and a new product called Azure Arc. These are graphical user environments to manage the tools, to manage the named resources in the servers. And why would you want to do that? Well, it's very simple. If you have specific systems you want to use for a resource and you want them to perform a specific role, it's a lot harder for hackers to engage those if they're core installations. But that doesn't mean that you have to work without a graphical tool set as an administrator, right? So if you're deploying Windows systems, you can deploy server systems without a graphical user environment. And again, unless hackers know a lot of PowerShell, they're going to look at this and go, okay, so I finally figured out how to get in there. Now what, right? They have to know their way around a lot of scripting language features and functionality, and it's just a lot of extra overhead. Now for you, as you're managing the environment, you have the best of both worlds. So the other thing about using core is that it uses a lot less resources. If I were to take this machine right here, if I were to take this desktop experience data center computer, right? So if I go here and I look at what I have for an operating system, I'm using one of the larger versions of the operating system on this machine, right? But this Windows interface is a lot of overhead. So much overhead that when I'm ready to set up virtual machines, I cannot set up as many virtual machines on my data center system because I installed it with the desktop experience. Now, if I did this instead and set up my Hyper-V server as a core server, and then connected, if I connected, see, this is the, let's see here, there we go. This is actually another management console. So this is another Microsoft Management Console, or MMC, just like computer management. I can sit from my laptop where I am right now, and with the right type of network connection and login, I can open up Hyper-V Manager on my system. If I install RSAT, Remote Server Administration Tools, on my Windows system, then I'll have an extra set of menus. When I look down, in Windows 10, you have Windows Administration Tools. So there are a couple of folders, Windows Tools, and here, let's, can everybody see this?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. So one of my administration tools shows the Hyper-V Manager because the role is installed. And here I have computer management, right? All of these administration tools, I can install that on my local machine, RSAT. I'll get the same view that I'm getting here, whether it's computer management or it's the Hyper-V Manager. And I can connect. So I can take this Hyper-V Manager and I can connect to another server, a server that's installed like this with Core. So I have the tools to work a graphical management environment efficiently. I can automate things. But when a hacker gets on this system, this is what they'll see, right? They'll have to know quite a bit about PowerShell in order to be able to do things. But the bigger issue is, if I had taken this system and installed Core instead of the desktop experience, there's a very good possibility I could run 50% more systems. Now, I haven't tried to max this out. The most I've had running at one time were 18 servers, 18 student servers on this machine. And right now I have 1, 2, how many do I have? Why is this doing this? 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, right? I have 7 machines. I had 18 at one point. If I were running Core, I might be able to push as far as 24 systems, because the graphical user interface is just a lot of extra overhead, and it's less secure, because anybody that gets on here, they're going to have a lot easier time finding their way around. Are there any questions about the Hyper-V environment? I will likely add a few details of what we've just reviewed in an addendum for our module. Let's see how far we can take our review of the rest today. So, Windows Deployment Service. We found out that that's a role. That role is something you install on the server, and then your system is like a train station. It's more like a rail yard where you have lots of different tracks and lots of different locomotives. When you set up your system as a WDS server, you can capture images. Does anybody remember the name of the tool that we use to create an image from an existing machine? An install media image? Not an operating system media, not an ISO, but if we wanted to clone an entire system, so we could use like a photocopy machine with it. Does anybody remember the name of the?
VDS, I think.
Say again?
VDS?
No.
No.
Let's see if Sysprep. Does that ring a bell? Sysprep.
Yes. I
Okay.
remember you mentioned it.
Yep. So every system, every Windows system has a sysprep tool. And you would use the sysprep tool to create a copy of your entire machine, kind of like a virtual machine in a container. And once you have that, you can load that image in the WDS machine and then just push it out to so many systems. You change the boot order for the system so that it boots from the network. I can show you how this works on Windows servers. If I look at the settings, and then I look at the firmware, just as I can in VirtualBox, I can move the network adapter up so that it's the first boot device. I can also do this here. If I go into the settings here, I can go into the system and I can select the network, enable it so that it boots up into what's called a PXE, a pre-executable environment. And I can move it all the way up so that it's the number one boot source after WDS is set up and active on the network. So that's the important thing to understand, is that I can allocate a virtual hard disk. I can configure the hardware components. I don't have to worry about getting a separate storage file in a virtual disk drive tray and then put the ISO in there. That's only going to get me the operating system loaded. But if I wanted a carbon copy of an entire system, I could use WDS with a whole machine image capture, right? It's like cloning the machine using sysprep, and then I can change the boot order so it boots into from the network interface. It'll see the WDS server. There'll be a menu and it'll say which machine do you want? And what you're going to get is the entire machine, including the applications, the configurations, everything. So if there's software that's preloaded, if you need 100 machines updated in a single afternoon at a company, you can basically get the machine that they are going to enjoy and love. It's good to get what's called a focus group. You get some guinea pigs from the staff to come on the screen and they say, oh yeah, I love it. It's got the new version of Excel. Oh yeah, I've got Xbox for my breaks, so I can do gaming when I'm on my break. I mean, assuming there's a work environment like that. True story, there are a lot of coding environments, software development interests in the territory where teams of programmers work together, and when they're on their break, they play on a foosball table or they do gaming. Everything that you want in there that you want to configure, right? I'm not sure why Disney Plus or TikTok are in there. I don't know. But in any case, you can configure everything exactly how you want it. And then as you capture that image, you're pushing it out to the WDS server. Once it's in the WDS server and the network card is set to boot first with a pre-executable environment, or PXE, that's called PXE, then when you start the virtual machine or the physical machine, so the virtual machine or the physical machine work the same way, it's going to wake up on the network instead of the hard disk, and it'll see the WDS machine. And at that point, it'll pull the thing down. It's possible to blast 100 workstation images into 2 computer labs in about 30 minutes with the right kind of switch and network. So what am I saying? You can completely overhaul and replace all of the 50 computers in a computer lab. So there's 50 workstations in each computer lab. You can do all 100 of those within a very short period of time, within 30 minutes with the right kind of managed network, right? So those things all fire up on a screen. You push a single button and 100 copies of the same image download into the hard disks. When you're finished, the important thing to remember is that you're changing the boot order back. So you go back into settings and you're going to put the hard disk at the top of the list and move the network back down again so that you don't have that problem. So, are there any questions about what we've covered as far as WDS is concerned? So this is a handy link that'll show you what you need to do to have for physical hardware if you're going to install a server on a physical machine. Remember, you don't, and look, you don't really need a whole lot, right? So 512 megs is the minimum. That's not a whole lot. If you want desktop experience, you can have a server with as little as 2 gigabytes. They're talking about a physical server, right? But if you keep rolling down, there's additional information on installing and automating the install process. And so you're going to want to click these links in here. Now, a poor man's version of WDS and WSUS, it's available in workgroup environments. So can you tell me if we've used, have we discussed a workgroup environment versus a domain environment? Is that something we've covered in this class?
I don't think we've covered that, no.
Okay. So let's connect some dots there. Let's pretend that you really can't set up WSUS. You don't have a machine that has enough resources to work well as a server, and you can't do the 2 server. You can't use these in tandem. So you don't have the resources to set up a WDS server and a WSUS server. You can turn on delivery optimization with any version of Windows. Does anybody know what I'm talking about? In settings, under updates, advanced options, there's an option called delivery optimization. Have you ever seen anything like this?
No. Didn't even know I was there.
Yes. So let's say that you have a new Windows laptop and it's been updated. You can turn this on, and what happens is that your machine stores an extra copy of the updates that are coming down from Microsoft. And you can select either devices on my local network or devices on the internet and my local network. Those can help speed up your update on other Windows machines. So once there's a local copy of an update, it can be stored on your machine. And if this is enabled, then other Windows machines can pull from it. It's a bit like, it's kind of like BitTorrent. So when you're looking at this model, what we have is, well, let me see if I can pull this up. In my control panel, I have administrative tool. Well, all right, in Windows 11, they took administrative tools out, but I'm going to search for the disk cleanup, right? So in Windows 10, that's in the administrative tools section of Windows, but I'm going to go ahead and run this. And when you're performing those tasks for optimizing your personal technology, does that ring a bell?
Yes.
Okay, so optimizing, when you select this option in setup to allow your update files to be used by other machines, it keeps a copy of your delivery optimization files in a hidden cache on your system. When you're running disk cleanup, you can check all of these boxes, but leave this one unchecked. So if you want to clean up your hard disk, you should check all of them, but leave this one unchecked, because those files, now if you're low on disk space, then you'd probably want to dump them. But over time, this gets to be really large. This can be gigabytes large. And what happens is that your own machine will help update the other machines in the local area up to 10 times faster, right? So even though it's better to use the servers, if you turn on delivery optimization, you can get updates much faster with your environment. Now, I did want to say something about security account management. So we've shown you that these machines here are a part of a domain. And when I look at each of these machines, they belong to the groovy.net domain. That means that in practical terms, the accounts that I set up for login work on all of the different machines. So if I had 4 different machines, one for Rhonda, one for Ranel, one for Jesus, and one for Cana, on the domain controllers, I would set up a single user account, one for Rhonda, one for Ranel, one for Jesus, and one for Cana. And if the password needed to change, we wouldn't have to change the passwords. We wouldn't have to set up separate accounts in each of these machines. In a workgroup environment, that's often called a standalone workgroup environment, right? It means that each of the machines have their own database of accounts and logins. So a SAM is the database in each of those systems that stores the accounts and the passwords and the logins for the users on that machine. In a workgroup environment, each machine stands alone. That's why it's called standalone as well. So if Rhonda wants to share her stuff with Ranel, Jesus, and Cana, Rhonda has to set up a login on her PC for Ranel, Jesus, and Cana. Ranel has to do the same thing for Rhonda, Cana, and Jesus. Jesus needs to do the same thing on his machine for Ranel, Rhonda, and Cana. And Cana has to do the same thing for Jesus, Ranel, and Rhonda. If Rhonda changes her password, she can't just change it here. She then has to go to Ranel's machine, change it to the same thing on Ranel, change it on Jesus's, go to Cana's machine and change her password on Cana's machine. And if all of the passwords are in the same, they're all the same, then what they're sharing and they set up sharing will still be accessible. But if Rhonda has to change her password here and she doesn't update it in these other 3 places, some of the things that are shared from these other machines may be broken and they can't be shared anymore. This is a really important concept. The idea that you can centralize accounts for users, accounts for computers and systems, right? And accounts for services, and you can control them from a central location. That's what we mean when we talk about a domain. Now in Linux environments, this is called a realm. So instead of being called a domain, it's called a realm. The install and maintenance tools that you have to use are very much more powerful in a domain environment. What you've done to this point is a standalone workgroup environment on your own machine. Now, before we finish today, what I wanted to do was to go out on the website yet, and I wanted to call your attention out to some new links. Have you seen the new links that we put out there for the solution? In here, so some of you have said, hey, I need some more information in order to be able to install my server. So actually, yeah, I moved the solution up to the top so it's easier to access. So here you see that there's a new link for server setup, and then server 2022 security basics. If you haven't, might be a good idea, even if you've already submitted your solution, to have a look at this, because it walks you through some quick changes you can do. And then if you post the steps you followed and just push your solution out there again, I'll go ahead and clear the first submission, but you'll earn additional credit. So you can take the server you set up in the module 1 solution and take it a step further. If you're still doing the module 1 solution setup, you just follow this YouTube. So I've posted 2 additional links, and then in your second module for your solution here, you'll be in a much better place to be able to finish this. And I think we walked through this in class, so you'll find the videos that you need to complete the module 2 solution inside the resources folder, right? So setting up shares and so on. Before we clear today, is there, oh yeah, and right here you see I'm talking about setting up your own GUI utility. So we're talking about RSAT and Windows Admin Center. That's actually going to be an assignment in module 3, but if you wanted to check that out and get a preview of coming attractions, you could see that. Inside the session recordings, yeah. So here's the solution part 1, solution part 2. We need everybody to finish reading the rest of this study guide so that we can complete our review on Friday. And we need everybody to turn in their assignments and solutions for modules 1 and 2 before we break for spring, the spring break. Does anyone have any questions or comments based on the material we presented? Okay, well, thank you for joining us today. We'll see you Friday.